I started Pachama after a trip to the Amazon rainforest in which I saw that deforestation. It's heartbreaking to see in one side of the road this lush, old-growth forest full of life, and in the right side of the road, a recent deforestation with a total clear-cut, total destruction of life. And we continue to do that because today there is an economic value on deforesting the land to do cattle ranching, to sell a burger for $1 in McDonald's. Mm-hmm. And there isn't a value for keeping a forest standing, even though that forest might be the key to keeping the planet at the temperature and with a system of life support that allows civilization to exist. So yes, carbon credits is a first attempt at giving value to these intangible services that ecosystems provide. And I do hope that in the next 20 years, we see the maturation of these other environmental services, and it's never going to be perfect, right? Because there's so many things that we cannot measure.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome. Today's conversation is with Diego Saez-Gil. Diego is the co-founder and CEO of Pachama, an exciting company in the climate tech space. And in today's discussion, we cover a lot around carbon credits. You know, carbon credits have received a lot of heat in the media recently, and Diego provides a nuanced take about why he believes many of these critiques are short-sighted or problematic. We talk about how new technologies can help address some of the issues with the current carbon credit system. We also talk about why we should be accepting some of the mistakes and learning from them rather than just pushing aside the ideas altogether. I asked Diego about capitalism, the risks of commodifying nature, taking VC money, and his visions for a brighter and more hopeful future. Diego is very eloquent and an emerging leader in this space. I hope you enjoy this conversation. It was recorded at SF Climate Week in April 2023. Diego Saez-Gil. We're here with Diego Saez-Gil. Diego is the founder and CEO of Pachama. Thanks, Diego, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start with what is Pachama?
So Pachama is a technology company that has a mission of helping restore nature to solve climate change. And what we do effectively is to harness the latest technologies such as satellite images, AI, and cloud computing and the internet to help modernize the way that we start, finance, and monitor projects that sequester carbon by reforesting or conserving forests or other ecosystems around the world. As you know, nature is a big part of the solution to climate change. Today, about a third of emissions come from the land, from burning forest, from destroying land to do agriculture or mining, and that's a problem that we need to solve. We need to stop deforestation. But also, humanity counts with about 2 billion hectares of land that can be restored as forest without competing with agriculture. And that gives us the potential to be sequestering several gigatons of carbon every year, effectively removing CO2 from the atmosphere and reversing the cause of climate change. And if we are to achieve 1.5 degree warming, which is a target of the Paris Agreement, we absolutely need to harness the power of nature. And beyond carbon, of course, these natural ecosystems are the habitat for wildlife, and we're also in a biodiversity crisis that need to be addressed. We need to recuperate ecosystems for wildlife and biodiversity. these ecosystems provide water, rain for communities around the world, and everything is interconnected in the planetary systems of Earth. So our intention is to help corporations and in the future governments to channel funding to projects that are doing reforestation and conservation around the world in a highly scalable way, with transparency, with accountability, making sure that the money goes to the right hands and produce the right impact, and that companies then can make the right claims if they're using carbon credits or other mechanisms to achieve their net zero targets, taking responsibility for their emissions. And in a way, we act as the connecting tissue, ensuring integrity and making the life of the different parties easier. The sustainability teams at companies and the farmers, landowners, and implementation partners around the world who can intervene the land to sequester carbon.
And help me understand, so Pachama has been around for 5 or 6 years
4
now?
years.
4 years. What's the scale of the work so far? How many projects under development? And I mean, you've raised venture money from some of the top tier investors in Silicon Valley. You've been very early in this kind of emergent category of climate tech. So yeah, take me through a bit of the journey.
Yeah, so we started in 2018. I was not from this world of climate and carbon. I was coming from building 2 technology startups in the travel industry, actually, which was my other passion.
And travel.
Yes, I am from Argentina. I left my country when I was 24. I wanted to see the world. I went to Europe to do my master's. I backpacked around the world, and I wanted to help other young people travel the world. So my first 2 startups were on the travel industry. But those travels around the world also made me aware of the way that we are impacting the planet. So always in the back of my head, I had climate change and the environmental crisis as a big worry. So in 2017, I was a free agent again, and I wanted to see what I could do to contribute to this crisis. I didn't know if a startup was the right vehicle. But after doing a lot of research and coming up with this idea or discovering this need, decided to start a company. And back then, there wasn't a climate tech category.
No, it wasn't super popular then.
No, VCs were focused on other things. But I went to Y Combinator, which is this accelerator here in Silicon Valley. I talked to one of the partners, Gustav Alstromer, who's a Swedish guy who cares a lot about climate change. I knew that because of his Twitter account. He was tweeting about climate change. So I reached out to Gustav and I said, hey, Gustav, I have this idea. Would like to run it by you. He invited me to the YC office and I drew the idea on a whiteboard. And he told me, this makes sense. You should do it. And I think that we will fund it. So decided to start a company.
And that idea at its essence, apologies for interrupting, is to connect these corporations and sustainability departments into land conservation and reforestation, and be that intermediary between those 2 worlds.
That's right. And this is an idea that existed already. Carbon markets existed already. They started around the Kyoto Protocol, which was the predecessor to the Paris Agreement. But the first iteration of carbon markets were designed and built in a world in which we didn't have the internet. We didn't have availability of satellite data. We didn't have AI. We didn't have all these tools that we have today. So the first iteration was paper-based and relationship-based. And
tape measures around trees.
You had to send auditors literally to the forest to measure a tree with a tape. And then you had to do these monographies, very long documents describing the project. And you still have to do that today.
Totally.
We're working to modernize, digitize that. So it's a very inefficient, gameable, confusing, and expensive system. And that had been hindrances for this idea to reach its full potential. So we didn't come out with the idea of pay people to sequester carbon.
Right.
But the idea was we have all these technologies, we can apply them to come out with a new generation of this market and make this idea work with integrity and with scale. And I think that the insight was that nature is the technology, right? Photosynthesis is the technology. We have these incredible machines that sequester carbon, regenerate themselves, and have all these co-benefits for humanity and other species. Why don't we harness this technology that's been under development for billions of years, right? But so we went to Y Combinator. They liked the idea. They accepted us into their program, and then they connected us to Chris Sacca, who was starting this fund called Lower Carbon, and was one of the first funds who said we're going to focus exclusively on solving the climate crisis. Then we were connected to Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a fund started by Bill Gates, who also said we want to invest in climate solutions, in climate breakthroughs. So you're right, we were early on a movement that started of investors and entrepreneurs and technology companies realizing that, number one, climate change is the biggest crisis of our generation. If we don't solve it, any other problem is irrelevant. Number two, that we need to use technologies and innovation and ingenuity to solve it. And number three, that it can be an economic opportunity, because we're talking about a transformation of the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution that needs to happen at the speed of the digital revolution.
Can you say that again?
And this is something that I actually heard from Mark Carney. I don't want to take credit for that quote, but we need a revolution at the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution.
Magnitude of the Industrial Revolution.
Because we need to transform every sector of the economy to be low carbon. And we need it at the speed of the digital revolution. We need it in 10, 20 years because that's the timing that we have to avoid catastrophic climate change. So we're talking about one of the biggest civilizational shifts that we need to make happen. And that's both scary, but also thrilling because it's full of opportunities. Right. And I think that humanity should take it with excitement because that's the right energy that's going to lead us to come out with the right ideas and to rally people around these ideas. The excitement of what's in the other side if everything goes right. There is a lot of apocalyptic thinking right now, and everybody's imagining how things will go wrong. But I think we need a little bit more of utopian thinking, how it's going to look like if it works, if we build a regenerative, sustainable, and fair civilization. That is on the table. Is it? It's going to be easy? No. It's going to take an enormous amount of work and all the human ingenuity. Right. But I think it's there. But coming back to the story, so we were early on this emergent category of climate tech. And now it's fascinating to see. This week is Climate Week in San Francisco. There are 90 events, 5,000 people who sign up to these events. And there's a movement of people that want to be part of this climate innovation that is happening in the Bay Area and around the world.
I was at an event you hosted last night, you co-hosted, and I mean, lawyers, technologists, product managers, environmentalists, people coming from completely other fields saying, I don't know what I want to do, but I know I want to be in climate, which, having not spent the last decade, in the Bay Area and coming back here, I'm like, wow, it's hitting the Silicon Valley zeitgeist or the technology, corporate, professional, startup zeitgeist in a way that's certainly shifted.
There are more than 100 venture firms solely focused on climate, and every venture capital firm has at least one partner who's focused on climate. So it's an amazing opportunity. And at the same time, we are living in this weird moment in which now there is a global economic downturn or uncertainty that is, a consequence of the pandemic still, the banking system was in a crisis, is in a crisis, right? We saw Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse collapse, right? So it's these weird times in which never is easy to build a company.
Right.
But I think that one thing I've been saying is that when you start a company with a purpose that is so important and so genuine, that is a source of motivation to go through any type of adversity. And that's one of the advantages that we have on the climate tech sector. But you asked me also about the impact. So yeah, today Pachama does two things. We work with projects that already are underway, issuing carbon credits around the world, conservation projects and restoration projects. And we partner with them to verify their impact using satellite data, to monitor their impact, and to then put them in front of companies that want to invest on those projects. And we call that a verified marketplace. And in that front, we work with projects in 15 different countries. We have helped fund projects that are protecting more than 2 million hectares of endangered rainforest in Brazil, Indonesia, Peru, and around the world. In the other side, we launched something that we call Pachama Originals. And it's us getting earlier on the life of a project, getting them go from 0 to 1, funding upfront the origination of these projects, helping these project developers with their carbon accounting, with their design, and with their implementation. We're focused on reforestation. We started in Brazil and are now expanding to Mexico and Argentina and the United States. We have some project in the Mississippi Basin in Louisiana. And of course, reforestation is very different than conservation. Land parcels are smaller, but you can sequester much more carbon because you're going from 0 to a forest. And you have to invest upfront into all the work that is needed in the seedlings and saplings and the labor that is needed to plant and protect this forest as they grow. And
are you providing the early project financing for those?
Yes, in
originals?
Partnership with corporations and investors.
I see.
So we partner with companies so there are some companies that need carbon credits today to achieve their sustainability goals. And we have these credits on the marketplace. But there are other companies that are a little bit more forward thinking who want to invest upfront on these projects, even if they don't get carbon credits right away. So we partner with these companies and we help them sponsor those projects. And also we partner with the investors that want to invest in these projects and get a return on that investment when the credits get issued and sold to companies. So we're trying to find all these different avenues to finance the early steps of starting a regeneration project. Because something that is crazy, in South America today, it's easier to get a loan from a bank to deforest and do agriculture than it is to get some financing to reforest or conserve a land. And that is because we still have not put the fair value of the environmental service, of the carbon and biodiversity and water services that ecosystems provide. So what we're trying to do is to create this paradigm of giving value to that and giving financing to that. And in that sense, we think that it's incredibly important to bring visibility and transparency to this market.
Yeah, I mean, it's so stunning, even when you know it, just to hear it back that, like, yeah, you can go get a loan from a bank to cut down the trees.
Yeah.
But you can't go get a loan to go plant the trees.
Yeah.
Right. And so clearly our financial system is not meeting the moment of the time.
Correct.
And you described Pachama as a technology company, but it sounds like it's very importantly a financing company, or really involved in bridging from those land projects and that regenerative work into financial instruments and creating investable opportunities for be it funds, corporations, or otherwise to actually get the credits and a return
Yeah.
or to sponsor a project. The Pachama Originals website is so beautiful. We'll put it on the screen for
Thank
those
you.
watching on video. I sent it to our design team because it's it's one of those rare examples where I see a web page and I'm like, finally, it doesn't look like every other environmental
Right.
web page, and the way that you created interactivity with sound, and it tells the story of the tree into the forest. And so I could tell your team has put a lot of love and care and attention into that part of Pachama and
Thank you.
the materials on the outside. How's it going between what is kind of the block and tackle, selling the existing credits out there versus the originals, the really originating these projects?
Yeah, but thank you for that. We always say that we want to have the best storytelling, the best marketing, because nature deserves that. Nature deserves the best marketing because it's an amazing thing for humanity. And we want to bring the best engineering and science, but also the best storytelling, finance, and like the best of humanity's talents at the service of this mission. But in terms of how it's going, yeah, I mean, we are very fortunate to be working with some of the biggest corporations in the world who really care about climate. Companies like Amazon and Shopify and Airbnb and Netflix and Nespresso. And these companies care. They have serious sustainability programs in which first they focus on reducing their emissions, investing in that decarbonization, and then second, they want to take responsibility for their current emissions and past emissions, and they are investing in these, carbon projects. And some companies are, as I said, they have commitments today. Some companies want to accelerate their achievement of net zero or carbon neutrality, and they're buying carbon credits today. And then other companies see it as a target for 2030, 2035, and therefore they invest upfront on the generation of the credits that they will need. Now, as I was saying, these are uncertain times, uncertain economic times. Many companies are doing layoffs, are cutting cost.
Yeah.
And I think that is unfortunately sometimes a hindrance to sustainability investments. But what we say to companies is that the risk of not investing upfront on sustainability is higher than the risk of waiting, I guess.
Right.
And in the other side, I think there is a lot of confusion about carbon markets.
Right.
There's been these articles in The Guardian and Bloomberg pointing to problems on this first generation of carbon credits. And I think that's an important discussion. It's important to show the problems. It's unfortunate that sometimes if you only read the headlines, you walk away with the feeling that this is all hot air and that this is an unfixable system. And that's not the case. The majority of the market is valid and is working hard to continue improving. Every sector of the economy needs to make mistakes in order to improve. There were cases in which bad players took advantage of the flexibility of the system in the first generation of it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue investing heavily on making this idea work of allowing companies to take responsibility for their emissions and allowing landowners and other project developers to sequester carbon. It's the only way that we're going to actually sequester carbon from the atmosphere.
Right.
But that confusion sometimes is a hindrance on
Totally.
sustainability professionals that have to make a decision and they don't want to screw up.
Because most of the time we're still in a paradigm where these are voluntary markets, right? So
Yeah.
there's not, these companies aren't being forced to buy carbon credits.
Not yet.
Not yet. So, when you see scary headlines that say 90% of carbon credits are worthless,
Yes.
this doesn't work.
Right.
It's like, well, why should I go spend a bunch of money on credits, which may or may not be contributing to the solution if I don't have to?
And what's sad is that the companies that get criticized are the companies that are actually doing something.
Right.
Whereas the companies that don't do anything, and most of the oil and gas companies are not doing anything, they don't get as much criticism as the ones who actually care and are trying a lot of different things to take responsibility in the face of a climate crisis.
Right.
So I actually think that we need much more responsible journalism covering this sector, speaking with nuance about the problems and those who actually care and are doing things and making mistakes, but making progress for the benefit of the cause.
Can you talk a bit? Let's go deeper on, given you have such an understanding of, okay, so what is the precise critique that Guardian and others are making, and what's the kind of rebuttal, and maybe just give us a bit of a 101 summary of that.
I think there are different criticisms. Some criticisms are more ideological, people who are opposed to companies, compensating their emissions, or people that think that companies should not be the ones solving climate change, that governments should do it. And I think that to those people, I cannot convince them otherwise, right? And I appreciate, and I think that these people should continue advocating for government investment, because we need that, absolutely. Now, there are some other people who say, well, this idea makes sense, but if you look at what happened in the past, there were many projects that took advantage of methodologies and exaggerated their claims. When it comes to conservation of forest, you have to make an assumption of what's going to happen on the absence of the project. That's a counterfactual scenario, baseline of business as usual, that you have to determine with some methodology. And in the past, project developers could come out with any methodology and exaggerate their claims and get lots of credits. And that's true that there's many projects in which that happen, and that needs to be fixed. And we shouldn't allow anymore for projects to be so, lax on their assumptions.
So if I go to a plot of forest and I'm like, okay, I want to invest in its protection.
Yeah.
And say, okay, well, how many carbon credits do I get for that investment?
Right.
Somewhere there has to be an assumption of like, well, what would happen if I didn't do this protection?
Correct.
Right. This is the baseline.
Correct.
And this is how we're also establishing additionality.
Correct.
And so, yeah.
And 10 years ago, we didn't have the tools that we have today, in which we have high definition satellite data of the history of an ecosystem, and we can use an algorithm to determine what is the rate of deforestation, what are the drivers of deforestation, and how they are going to affect a given particular area of interest. And then you can predict what's going to happen. And then you can recheck every year what is actually happening and reestablish a baseline. That's what we call dynamic baselines.
So I could have said, well, that guy over there cut his trees down and they over there cut their trees down. So this forest is going to be gone next year if I don't step in. So pay me a lot of money.
Correct.
And what you're saying is, well, yeah, now we have a lot of fancy new tools and a lot more science, measurement, and ways to do this.
So there were a few projects in which, the project proponents said, this forest is going to be gone in 5 years. Therefore, I should get credit for, if I protect it, for the entire carbon stock. But reality is that the deforestation rate was actually 2% every year, right? So it's true that there are projects like that, and we need to phase out those projects, and we need to establish mechanisms to avoid these type of projects to exist anymore. But that doesn't mean that every project is like that. We've seen many, many projects around the world who were very conservative on their assumptions, who invested very decidedly into the actions that needed to happen to stop deforestation or to start regeneration. And it's very sad for me when I hear throwing the baby with bathwater.
Yeah.
And there are communities and families that depend on those projects who did nothing wrong. And now, in a way, are suffering by, being put in the same bag as some projects that made mistakes.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to acknowledge the problems, highlight the good work of the projects who did the right thing, and support them, keep supporting them, and ensure that the next generation of projects, and really what matters is what we're going to do in the next 2 decades. What have we learned in the last 10 years, and what do we do in the next 20 years to make sure that these mechanisms effectively drive a climate meaningful impact, all while benefiting local communities and benefiting the local ecology as well.
Right.
So I think that, in short, there are issues. This is just one example of an issue. There are other issues as well, but all the issues can be fixed with new technologies and, of course, with integrity and transparency values, right? And there is a whole new generation of organizations that are coming into the market to bring these new tools, but also this new spirit, this spirit of high integrity, knowing that the stakes are really, really high.
Yeah.
That if we don't get this right, the planet's at risk.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, and really resonate. Like, if we just think about the Amazon rainforest and the amount of benefit to human life and all of life that it provides in terms of carbon sequestration, temperature moderation, biodiversity,
Correct.
source of, so much, complexity of life and millions of years of evolution that we can barely grasp and understand. We all benefit from that, I mean, it helps moderate and regulate the water cycle on the entire
Yes.
planet. And so how is it that we have an economic system where there's only value to cut down those trees,
Yes.
and that there's no value in protecting, preserving, and maintaining this abundant forest? And so carbon credits are definitely flawed because they're kind of a crude, humanized financial instrument that's just in its nascency. But there have been a bunch of other types of financial vehicles tried and failed, and carbon's the one that seems to be getting velocity and traction, right?
Yeah.
I mean, are you seeing other alternatives to carbon credits that get you excited?
So, I mean, there is an exploration of biodiversity credits that's not yet on the market, but there are different groups that are working on frameworks and methodologies for biodiversity credits, water credits, and other environmental service credits. But you're right. I mean, it's a travesty that humanity doesn't put value to something that gives us so much value to all of humanity and all of life on Earth. We're destroying the Amazon rainforest at an astonishing rate. We all heard the stats of several soccer fields per second, and that continues to happen. And in fact, I started Pachama after a trip to the Amazon rainforest in which I saw that deforestation. It's heartbreaking to see in one side of the road this lush, old-growth forest full of life, and in the right side of the road, a recent deforestation with a total clear cut, total destruction of life. And we continue to do that because today there is an economic value on deforesting the land, to do cattle ranching, to sell a burger for $1 in McDonald's. And there isn't a value for keeping a forest standing, even though that forest might be the key to keeping the planet at the temperature and with a system of life support that allows civilization to exist. So yes, carbon credits is a first attempt at giving value to these intangible services that ecosystems provide.
Right.
And I do hope that in the next 20 years, we see the maturation of these other environmental services, and it's never going to be perfect.
Right.
Because there's so many things that we cannot measure. Right.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that in a bit. Maybe before we get there, so you described dynamic baselines as kind of one way to address some of the shortcomings of carbon credits. Another critique I'm hearing a lot recently is like, well, there were a bunch of credits given to a forest or some trees in California, and then those trees burned down.
Right.
Right. So what's the kind of thinking about how we approach those issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's another issue. And like it or not, we're going to see more fires. And I'm actually a victim of forest fires. My house burned down in 2020
Oh, my
in the
goodness.
California fires here. I lost everything.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it was hard, but at the same time, I appreciate the level of empathy that I gain on the effects of climate change that many people, millions of people are going to suffer, are suffering, right? In places like Pakistan, India, and around the world. So there's going to be forest fires. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't protect and restore forest. In fact, it means that we need to do it more.
Right.
And then we need to try to estimate with the best technologies and the best statistics what is the likelihood of forest fires and improve those models over time and account for that risk on a carbon accounting that we do. Now it's true that 10 years ago that wasn't the case. We live in a new climate reality, and there's projects that were designed 10 years ago in California, in which we didn't account for the risk of forest fire, and now there's all these reversals, and there is a question of what happened with these carbon credits. They're up in flames, right? Let's learn from that experience, and let's incorporate this new thinking into the next generation of carbon credits.
And that next generation wouldn't suggest that those credits somehow get reversed as much as it suggests there's more of a discounting mechanism to the forecasts?
Discounting mechanism, and also buffer pools and insurance. Buffer pools, like today, every project needs to contribute to a buffer pool from which credits get taken when there is a reversal. We need to improve the mechanisms to do these buffer pools. We need to maybe complement with insurance, and there are insurance companies getting involved in this new redesign. And yeah, we need to account for the risks, and then we need to prevent the risk as well. So, for example, one project I was in Brazil recently visiting, they have created a citizen network of fire respondents, in which is a WhatsApp group basically on the area. And whenever there is a fire, they start coordinating on WhatsApp to go quickly and react to forest fires. And as a result of that, they have maintained these reforestation projects very, very healthy.
Got it. Okay, so you alluded earlier that companies aren't required to purchase credits yet.
Right.
So is the assumption there, the implication that you think they will be?
There is happening in certain jurisdictions, such as California, who has a not perfect but first attempt at a market in which big polluters have to compensate their emissions, have to cap and compensate their emissions. There are experiments in Canada, in the European Union, in Korea, in China, and I definitely think that we should expect governments to at some point either put a price on carbon or enforce some compensation of your carbon emissions. We're seeing the SEC in the US now requiring disclosures of your climate risk, your carbon emissions, and your carbon compensation. And everything is moving in the direction of this being required. I think that today there is enough pressure from investors who care about ESG, employees who care about the impact of their companies, clients who care about the impact of their supply chain on their scope 3, that companies, even though it's voluntary, are starting to feel a compliance-like pressure. And I think that in that sense, the companies who are moving forward ahead of these regulatory headwinds actually are going to benefit from being early on this market.
Got it. Okay, so what I hear you suggesting is like, all right, we have this new thing called carbon markets. Now we have technology to come in. We can do this much more effectively in terms of protecting and reforestation to measure, monitor, and it sounds like there's these new methodologies and kind of a dynamism to baselining and learning and iterating that can be applied so that as these collective trends that are tailwinds, if you will, for compliance, for ESG, for employment engagement, for sheer consciousness awakening on the planet, that we're destroying the very tissues in the fabric of our biosphere, that all of these things are going to cascade into more and more momentum for these markets. And that there might be subsequent ecosystem services like markets, whether it's in biodiversity and water. So can we get to like the ideological aspect of like, okay, commodification of nature.
Yeah.
Can you really measure any of this? Is this financialization and capitalism just gone, even more awry? Like, how do you balance that sense of like, we're just kind of almost doubling down on the system and the thinking that has created this mess.
Yeah.
To try to address it.
When I imagine my utopia 100 years in the future, I imagine a world in which nature is protected for its inherent value in which humanity has come back to remember the sacredness of life. And we don't need neither carbon markets nor regulations. Maybe there isn't money. Maybe there is a different system of exchange of talents of humanity. But we're not there yet. So I try to balance my idealism with realism, because what we need today is to meet civilization where it is and take it gradually towards where we want to go. So today we have this financial capitalistic society in the Western world that uses money to drive incentives for humans to intervene on the resources of the planet. If we don't create an economic and financial incentive to protect and restore nature, we're going to lose it. So while I can see the shadows of using a financial system that has so far mainly destroyed nature to help protect it and restore it, I think that Aikido is necessary to take us from where we are to where we want to be. And really the stakes are really high, and the speed at which deforestation is moving requires this pragmatism. And I do also imagine that in between this post-capitalistic utopia and where we're today, there is a conscious capitalism. There's a capitalism in which organizations are not just focused on maximizing shareholder value, but stakeholders' value, in which stakeholders include local communities, local wildlife, and the planet as a whole. And I think we're seeing many examples. Companies such as Patagonia, of course, is pointed often as a thought leader in this, but we're seeing an entire emergence of organizations. Salesforce is another organization in which they've been leading the way on stakeholder capitalism. Airbnb, companies that understand that you cannot focus only on profits and shareholder maximization. You need to be an engine of regeneration because you operate in a planet that needs to be healthy so that you can do business on it.
And how does that reflect for you at Pachama around kind of this conscious capitalism or stakeholder value, given that you are VC backed and have a strong, underpinning of for-profit incentive?
I was very upfront with my investors that this is a purpose-driven company, that we are never going to compromise our values. And our values are integrity, excellence, tenacity, and purpose. And all our investors love that. I think that they self-selected for investors who really think the way that we think and want to create examples of companies that become very valuable and yet didn't compromise on their values, on their purpose. So if you look at our investors, they all have stated that that's what they are looking for. And that's what gives me hope that actually there is this new venture capitalism that cares about impact. And I actually think that there is this beautiful alignment in which if you have a business model that is aligned with your purpose, then you can run as a venture company and try to grow as fast as possible, the way that Uber and Airbnb grew. In our case, if we can grow as Uber and Airbnb, that would be amazing for the planet, because it would mean that we will be restoring hundreds of millions of hectares of land around the world, right? So we can repurpose these vehicles, which are venture-backed startups, into these missions that are needed for the Earth. And it's basically, in my mind, using the best of capitalism to tackle these crises that are so daunting.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree that, like, within those first, call it 5-7 maybe 10 years of a company's life cycle, that the venture capital model can be extremely transformative in this kind of climate space, because it allows for much more rapid scaling by bringing on a lot of capital on the balance sheet.
Right.
Where you can't get that from raising from the nonprofit space as easily, or from kind of trying to bootstrap with your own business model. What I worry about is after that, you know, and in Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, you know, there's the chart and it shows, like, you know, all the company profits really come after year 10.
Sure.
And so when you ask the question, like, well, where are those profits going to really come from?
Yeah.
And when you're in this space of dealing with forests and large tracts of land and so forth, like, I'm not saying you're doing this, but certainly the history of corporations, I would say the abundance of evidence is on our side to suggest that the extraction comes from nature, right? And so how do we do what you said of aligning the incentives of the business model, right? To not, and I guess I emphasize this point because I do see a lot of well-intentioned entrepreneurs maybe not critically examining the structure that they're starting with by taking on venture money.
Yeah.
And I'm worried that we'll wake up in a decade and have to kind of deal with the consequence. What do you think about that?
Yes, in our case, our business model is that we only make money if 10 times more money go into people on the ground that are restoring and protecting nature. We have different margin structures for different levels of services that we provide, but basically we only make money if there is an impact, positive environmental and social impact on the ground. Now, you can imagine that if we grow and grow and grow, and all of a sudden we're driving billions of dollars from corporations and governments into landowners, farmers, indigenous communities, NGOs who are doing work on the land, and we take a margin for the services that we provide in between, this company can be very profitable.
Of course.
And the profits are, you know, aligned with impact. I like to think of profits as fruits. In fact, they have a similar etymology.
Yeah. Interesting.
A tree to reproduce needs fruits. An organization to grow needs profits that can be reinvested into innovation and into expanding their impact. And you were saying one of the benefits of venture capital is that we can capitalize ourselves up front, hire incredibly brilliant individuals, because this requires the best scientists, the best engineers, the best marketeers, as we were talking before, right? And I'm poaching people from the best companies in the world, right? Google, Microsoft, Amazon, OpenAI, NASA, and I'm paying them very fairly because I think they deserve it. They're, you know, best in the world. And we can only do that because we got this upfront investment. And then hopefully we can maintain that by having an engine of profits that allow us to keep hiring incredible people and putting the best talent of humanity at the service of figuring this out, innovating, creating new tools and new technologies. So again, maybe, you know, I'm idealistic on thinking that, you know, shareholder pressure never is going to change. But again, I think it's all about who do you choose to surround with.
Right.
And I've been very, very intentional on who do I pick as an investor, who do I pick on my board, who do I pick on my leadership team, even who do we pick as customers, to be honest. We have said no to customers.
Yeah, I've run a venture-backed company, and I completely agree that key question of who do you surround yourself with ends up being, you know, the most important. And I'm certainly glad to hear that you're poaching talent from all of the corporations out there to come work on this mission for Earth. I want to get to that question about measurement, and maybe, you know, some people hearing this might think, you know, it's just like this techno-utopian that you can use satellites and AI and whatever fancy buzzwords to do. Like, how important are these new technologies? Like, do they make things a little bit easier? Is it like a huge shift? And yeah, like how do you balance this tension of the complexity of an ecosystem where there's so many things that can't be measured and understood with trying to apply measurement to it?
First, I would say that yes, I am a techno-utopian, and I don't think that necessarily my utopia is the right one. We should all have our own utopia, and then let's co-create the best utopia for all. But I always see technology. Nature created humans, human created technology, and therefore nature created technology. And I like to think that technology ultimately is going to be at the service of nature.
Yeah.
Today, we're still in this adolescence phase of technology in which it's mostly destroying nature. But I think that the ultimate purpose of technology, in my utopia, is to be at the service of protecting life on this rock that has this miracle of life and consciousness. Now, the way that we can measure and monitor and process that data has improved exponentially in recent years. Today, we have this explosion of satellites, thousands of satellites orbiting the planet, capturing data of our planet. We have an explosion of IoT sensors that can measure all sorts of things, that can be deployed everywhere because the cost has gone down. We have cloud computing in which we can process terabytes of data, GPUs, right? And we have AI, which is advancing exponentially, as we're seeing, with ChatGPT and other products. And I am very excited about this awakening of Earth measuring and understanding itself, right? As Alan Watts said, we are the universe perceiving itself. And in a way, I see the Technium allowing us to understand Earth systems. And you can only protect what you understand. And we still don't truly understand how the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the geosphere, the oceans, the winds, the chemical reactions that happen between all these things interact with each other to produce these incredible conditions for life. So I think that we must use technology to understand our planet and to protect it and to ensure the continuation of life, not only human life, but non-human life for the foreseeable future.
Beautiful. Well, it's SF Climate Week. You're a very busy man. I really appreciate you getting up early this morning before your meeting with the mayor, and I know you have to go shortly. Are there any final messages or reflections that you'd like to share?
I guess, as I said yesterday on the event, everyone's job is a climate job right now. I am a big instigator of people jumping and working on climate, but I also think that no matter what your job is, whether you work in a big corporation, in government, in nonprofits, or at home, I think that you can have an impact. I do believe in the power of the individual, especially the power of the individual coming together in communities to have an impact. So my message to people is just go and figure out what you can do to be part of the solution.
Great, Diego. Are there any other, calls to action for people to engage with your work?
Yeah, come check out our website, follow us on social media, and when we have open roles, come work for us. Advocate your company to become net zero, and hopefully let's work together.
I really appreciate all of your time and your expressions, Diego, and the work that you're doing. Thank
you so much.
Well, I hope you liked that conversation with Diego. I appreciate that he's just out there making things happen. He has a very pragmatic lens, but also just such a contagious optimism and enthusiasm for the beauty and love of nature. And I also appreciate that Diego is from the Global South, and he has firsthand experience of the impacts of climate change in losing his house and his belongings to the fires. If you want to learn more, go to pachama.org. There's a link in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this conversation, you might also be interested in the discussions we had with Troy Carter, also at SF Climate Week, as well as Paul Gamble from Nori and Rez at Solid World. All of those discussions hit on different aspects of climate finance and carbon markets. The links are available, as well as all of our discussions, at maearth.com. That's MAEARTH.com. And it is our first season of The Regeneration Will Be Funded. Please leave us your comments and feedback, like, share, subscribe, and join our community Discord. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Cheers.